All right. Good morning, everybody. This nice, beautiful day. We just need some more of this over the next few days, hopefully. My background's in farming, so whenever you're 5 inches below normal rainfall where I live, everything's dying. So hopefully this will start to revive everything. Okay. So this is where I left off. The intent for today is I will finish the endocrine system because you have an exam on Thursday, which covers the first three systems. And remember, I classify the introduction lectures as a system, technically. So just to tell you what you're in store for you on Thursday, I've finished the exam, writing the exam this morning. So the exam consists of 3 pages. 1 page per system. There will be one page, which will consist of, there are 3 questions. There is a question that involves the introduction lectures. There's a question that involves the nervous system, and one with the endocrine system. Within that question, there is up to, I think, 7 sub-questions. So that way I break it down. You'll see each sub-question tells you how many points are there. I'll ask you questions. The short answer, you don't have to worry about spelling and grammar, etc. Just get your idea across. You can draw pretty pictures if you wish toward answering it. And it tests your understanding of the materials. All right. So I'll pass this out on Thursday. You'll have throughout the whole period to do that. If you need to write on the back, you can. You shouldn't need to unless you really write big. But that's what you're looking for. I've already posted some sample questions. They're fairly, if you understand the concepts, you shouldn't have any trouble. All right. So with that introduction, let me proceed. This is where I left off. We were talking about receptors and how receptors involve binding, but we also have to have transduction of the signal into the cell. Now, I won't spend a lot of time on this, but what's really critical here is the hormone ligand binds receptor. This is driven by the affinity of that receptor for that ligand. All right. So basically, as long as the hormone is binding to that receptor, that will initiate cell signaling into the cell. So that means that we need to keep that receptor occupied by that hormone. So we deal with something called the binding. So when we talk about binding, we talk about this complex. We have a hormone, we have a receptor. When it's bound, we have a complex. Then that complex isn't infinite. It is driven, the binding is driven by the affinity. The affinity will also determine how well it stays bound. So we have association and dissociation. These play critical roles. So you can have a receptor that has an affinity for a hormone that can vary due to a number of things we won't get into. But basically, as we increase the affinity, we're going to decrease usually the dissociation, the likelihood to dissociate. All right. So basically what you're looking at here is this is what's happening to this. This is referred to as the Scatcherd equation. This was written up in 1956, the year I was born, and it's still used today. And there are newer versions that came out about 40 years ago, hill plots, etc. But they're all basically looking at the same thing, and that's studying how these hormones bind to the receptors, right? Now, I'm not going to ask you to know this for the exam, so don't worry. Just this is only to educate you in that regard. Now, this is something different, all right? Well, this is applying this. So what I want to focus on is several basic concepts. All right. I've already told you about dose responsiveness and increased hormones, and then we're talked about affinity. So let's put all this stuff together. All right. So what you're looking at here are basically biological response curves. All right. So this means, I want to deal with some different things, but to set things up, as I increase the hormone concentration, That's the likelihood of interacting with receptors on responsive cells within tissues within animals. So I'm going to get a corresponding increase in biological response. All right. Now, as you note, this is basically this is a log curve on the x-axis with concentration. And let's look at B in the center. What I want you to note that this is a sigmoidal curve. All biological response elements behave in this manner. If we plot this in this plot, we will get a sigmoidal curve. Now, there are three critical components to this curve, which are invariable. I repeat, invariable. Number one, we have to have enough of a hormone to have the likelihood to interact with those receptors to initiate a biological response. This is referred to as the tow region here. Note that if we don't have any, we can't stimulate the response. We have to add enough so that we increase the likelihood of it interacting with a receptor population, resulting in a biological response. So we start to get a response. We enter what is referred to as a logarithmic section of this curve. Notice as we have an increase in concentration, we get a corresponding increase in response. At some point, we will reach a leveling off, at which if we continue to add additional hormone, we don't get any additional response. All right? So all biological response curves are sigmoidal. By definition, they just have to be because we're talking about concentrations. There's this tow region where we have to have enough to even initiate a biological response. Then we have this region where we have this log phase, and then we reach saturation. All biological response curves in endocrinology, I don't care whether we're talking cell proliferation in vitro, milk production in vivo, cell growth, it doesn't matter what it is, we can express it here. All right. Now, what you see here is interesting. So, because what we're watching here is that basically we have three curves, and B, let's say that is our normal native response. Okay. Now I can have I'm going to engineer this hormone. So basically that means that I can use less of it to get the same effect. What does that mean? That basically shifts the curve to the left in this version over here. So that means even though I'm using the same concentration, I can use less of it to get the same effect. All right. So that just means that this particular variant of our normal hormone is more sensitive in inducing a biological response. Over here, it's just the opposite. So that means in order to get the same biological response, I have to add more of that particular hormone variant, right? So routinely what we do is we will graph the hormone concentration, log scale, x-axis, y-axis, our biological response curve, normalized to 100% maximum, all right? And then if we draw a line at the 50%, this is how we can then say at 50% maximum response for B, it's 1 nanomolar, and A, it shifts to the right at 0.1, and C, it shifts to the it shifts to the left 0.1, shifts to the right 10. All right. So we can, this is normally done. We've been doing this for decades. All right. Now, one of the things that we've talked about, when we talked about how we have a hormone, it's binding to its receptor, and because of all the intracellular machinery, this can increase the actual responsiveness. Now, what we also see is that there are this concept of spare receptors. What this means is I can get maximum biological response without saturating all of the receptors. All right. So first off, before I go into the details, why is this an important concept within physiology? So two things I'm going to reemphasize. The hormones that are occurring in your body are at very low concentrations. That means there's very few molecules floating around. In order for them to have a biological effect, they have to bind to a receptor. There is a finite number of receptors in the body associated with cells because there's only so much landscape on a cell. So that means that the receptor populations are limited. So let's say for a growth hormone type of a growth factor based hormone, there are 1,500 receptors per cell. All right. Now, the concentrations of the corresponding hormone to interact with those receptors is on the range of nanomolar to femtomolar concentration. That means we have small number of molecules, a limited number of receptors. The concept of spare receptors means that this maximizes whatever the affinity is, etc. This means that I can get an equivalent biological effect without saturating all of those receptors. Okay, that's what is meant by spare receptors. And now if we look at the graph, we have hormone concentration on the x-axis. On this y-axis, we have binding. And on this, we have biological response. So what it shows is that if we look at the KD, which is the KD for binding, that is at 50%, that drops down to 1 nanomolar. If we look at the ED50, that is your biological response. That is considerably less. The difference here to here is spare receptors. The take-home message is easy. We don't have to saturate those receptor populations to get a maximal response, right? And that's because of the scarcity of both the hormones and the receptors. Now, this concept over here is dealing with receptor abundance. We've talked about we're increasing the concentration of the hormones. That's going to increase the likelihood of binding to available receptor populations. But what if I increase the receptor density or the receptor number per cell? That means I'm going to have also a corresponding increase in the likelihood of those receptors binding available hormones. So as I increase the receptor abundance in a given tissue or on a cell population, that means that the concentration that yields a corresponding half maximal biological response goes down. Makes sense, right? Makes practical sense. Okay. Now, over here, what we're dealing with is sensitivity, all right, and in terms of biological response. So basically, in this particular, and so what we're looking at is that the concentration or the response, we're talking response, affinity was, sensitivity was the prior one. So in this one, what happens is the half maximal response is the same, occurs at the same concentration, but the maximum biological response, not in percentage, but in arbitrary units, depends. So in other words, the concentration at half maximal is the same, but what that means is this is going to give me a least response, medium response, and the highest response, right? Then this is independent of concentration, right? So this means that what are the downstream responsive aspects to respond to this hormone, right? So what we can have here is this. So let's say that basically here's a normal response curve. Notice the sigmoidal response. Here's the toe, logarithmic, and then we have our saturation point. Now, if we have a decreased sensitivity, that means it needs more to get the same thing. So the curve shifts to the right. That's what we see here. A decreased responsiveness means that we don't shift the curve to the right or left, but we shift it down. So now we move it here. We can also have a reduction in sensitivity and a reduction in responsiveness, which means we shift the curve to the right and shift the curve down, right? Now, this concept, I told you on last Thursday that you have practically thousands of hormones interacting with the cells at the same time. So that means in the body you have all of these hormones and there is the likelihood of them interacting. Now, and so I'm not saying that they are competing for binding on the same receptors. They're binding to their own receptors, but those downstream pathways can either do one of three things. It may be completely independent. And so, in other words, the two, if I stimulate with two hormones that have both completely independent effects. Number two, they can have a positive interaction. That means if I combine those could give me some enhanced responsiveness. Or they could have some inhibitory. So that means I add them together and whatever the response I'm measuring goes down. So it can have no effect, it can have an enhanced effect or an inhibitory effect. All right. So that means that all these hormones can be interacting. So I'm going to give you an example. So this is with humans. And what we're doing is you're looking at blood glucose levels in response to a variety of hormones, okay, added individually and added together to actually drive home the message I want to get across. So if I feed somebody a lot of sugar and then I give them, or I'm not giving them anything, I'm just going to give them the drugs. I give them cortisol. This is a glucocorticoid. It is a steroid-based hormone, and it will induce a slow increase in sugar. What we see here, blood glucose levels go up, right? I give glucagon, it gives me a rapid increase, and then it goes down. If I give epinephrine, I get a moderate release that continues to go up and then gradually starts to go down. All three of these have some impact on blood glucose. Now, let's add them together and look at the effects. So if I add glucagon and epinephrine, I get an increase, a rate comparable to glucagon itself, but it stays up comparable to epinephrine. Now, what we call this increase is we say it's an additive response, which means, generally speaking, if I add glucagon and epinephrine, roughly speaking, they add up to this. So we call that an additive increase, right? Now, if we add cortisol, glucagon, and epinephrine, what you see here clearly is that if I add cortisol, epinephrine, and glucagon, and I add those, that does not go anywhere close to coming to what those actual values are of the three together. And we refer to that as not an additive response, but a synergistic response. So this is a synergistic additive response. Right? I'm just showing you this as an example so that you can appreciate that these things are interacting. They're not independent necessarily. Okay, now I told you in the introduction when we started talking about control systems that when we got the endocrine system, it's nothing but control systems. So from this point on, we're going to talk about endocrinology control systems. All right, so basically remember in the control system, you have a variable which has to be measured, and then you have a control center which will regulate a efferent response, which will change that variable. And as it comes back to whatever its preset value is, we have negative feedback, so we don't overshoot. And this allows us to maintain a dynamic equilibrium. Now, I'm going to give you a range of control systems here momentarily, and this is just showing the relative complexity of those control systems in general. And we can also, remember I talked about the seesaw technique. I've actually talked about a couple of those control systems. We'll revisit them as well, but this is just showing we have all the elements. You need to remember those for exam purposes. You know, what is a control center? What is the variables, the receptors, the control systems, the effectors, etc. And these can be rather complex in endocrinology, as you will see. Now, up to this point, we've talked about staying within a physiological state and this state of dynamic equilibrium where we need to have negative feedback so we don't overshoot. However, there are instances where we have positive feedback, which means the more of we get an increase in our variable output, we will further enhance that variable output. The purpose, again, I told you for positive feedback is to transition between physiological states. We don't care about dynamic equilibrium, not homeostasis. And homeostasis refers to a physiological state. The purpose of positive feedback is to transition outside between physiological states. So I'll get into more detail when we get into reproductive, but basically, in this particular example, we're talking about parturition, giving birth. All right. So we have a fetus. It's a human fetus at 9 months. We'll talk about how it directs parturition, but in part, what's going to happen is this. The baby is up here. It's time to be delivered. The head is pushing on the cervix. That then results in a mechanical receptors providing information to the posterior pituitary, which will then secrete oxytocin. Oxytocin will travel via the blood to the uterus, where it will stimulate the uterine wall contractions. That pushes the baby's head with more force against the cervix. This gives positive feedback. That means more oxytocin is released, more contractions, more oxytocin, more contractions. Eventually, baby out. All right? Baby in, baby out. Pregnant, not pregnant. The mom doesn't want baby half in and half out. All right? No negative feedback. Only positive feedback, because eventually you want the baby to come out. All right? Now, again, just to reiterate that there is the interaction between multiple hormones and their effector systems. So here is a classic, simple response system. Basically, we have our hormone, our variable. It binds to the receptor. It elicits an effect. And those reactions have negative feedback. Really simple. All right? But things are seldom that simple in the body because we can have multiple things. So just generally speaking, we have two different hormones. This hormone has its own receptor, its own set of effectors, and its own set of biological actions and negative feedback. Hormone 3 has its own receptors, but it elicits multiple effects. They have their own negative feedback. But hormone 2 could impact the receptor population. For the hormone 3 over here, maybe it changes affinity, maybe it changes receptor number. Anyway, it can alter the effect. Not to mention the fact that receptor 3 could change effector 2 over. So these are just examples. The point here is this, that these multiple hormones either binding, going through their own pathways, can then have influence additional pathways on either side, right? And that can change output. Okay? So let's look at these individual, I'll give you some examples of these control systems. We'll start with a simple one. Yes, a simple one. This is maintaining calcium homeostasis. Why do we need calcium? You already have some idea. Okay, so remember, calcium is critical for neuron communication. Just to remind you, so you have your ax potential coming down the length of the axon. It gets to the terminal bud. We have these voltage-gated channels for sodium are transitioning to voltage-gated channels for calcium. Calcium flows into the terminal bud. This initiates exocytosis and the release of neurotransmitter. So calcium is absolutely critical for neural communication. We'll talk about its roles in skeletal muscles and all these other things later, but it needs to be controlled. We need to maintain homeostasis for numerous physiological functions. So how has that occurred? All right, so the variable, of course, is calcium, and it's in the blood. It needs to have a receptor to measure it. Where is that? That's in the parathyroid glands. Here is my thyroid gland right here. If you put your fingers right here above your sternum and you swallow, you can feel this little structure. That's your thyroid gland. All right. Now, they intersperse in the thyroid gland because the thyroid gland makes T3, T4 thyroid hormone. There's the parathyroid gland, or little nodules that exist in there, and they are controlling calcium. Okay. So the receptors are in the parathyroid gland. They're measuring blood calcium. When it drops below preset value, the parathyroid gland will release PTH, parathyroid hormone. This enters the blood and has a number of functions. So let's walk through that. First off, it goes to the kidney. Not first, but it goes to the kidney. There it will regulate the maturity of vitamin D3. Okay? Now, wait a minute. Your body makes vitamin D3. If you go out in the sunlight, your skin makes vitamin D3, but it is the inactive metabolite. It needs to become active, and that occurs in response to the kidney receiving PTH. It now activates the vitamin 3 to the active metabolite. All right? Now, obviously, a lot of CMU students don't see a lot of sun for many reasons. Okay? So that means your body doesn't make vitamin D3, but you consume it in your diet. Whether you have various dairy products or whatever, you'll see a lot of them are fortified with vitamin D3. Okay? So why do we need vitamin D3? It goes to the intestine and tells the intestinal tract to absorb dietary sources of calcium. Calcium you get from dairy products, from soybeans, from collard greens, you name it. Lots of things have got calcium, Tums, whatever. All right. But without vitamin D3, the active metabolite, it will just pass on through. So vitamin D3 influences the absorption of dietary calcium, which is going to increase blood calcium levels. Right. PTH also goes to bone. In going to bone, it will stimulate the resorption or breakdown of bone, which releases calcium into the blood. This is an additional way at which blood calcium increases. The combination of mobilization of stored calcium in bone and dietary calcium absorbed in the intestine result in an increase in blood calcium. That then is read again by the parathyroid gland, and it reduces the release of PTH so you don't overshoot. Right? So the variable is calcium. The receptors exist in the parathyroid gland. The primary effector is PTH, which is released from the gland. Now it goes to separate effector systems. It goes to the kidney. Then there's an effect, a downstream effect on the intestine, and it has an effect on bone. And then the net effect is to increase the variable. So the control center is also in the parathyroid gland. All right. So this is a relatively simple control system for endocrinology. It's the one I always use to start the conversation. So before I go further into that, I want to talk about a couple of things. And that is the intersection between the nervous system on this hand and this hand, the endocrine system. I've already told you in the last lecture how they're like this. I'm going to give you specific, clear examples. So the first one is that two endocrine organs, which are classically associated endocrine organs, are part of the brain. You have the hypothalamus and the pituitary. The pituitary is divided into the anterior and posterior pituitary. The posterior pituitary in the front is the anterior, posterior is the one in the back. All right? Now, they make hormones. So let's talk about them because it's really important because these are two primary endocrine organs, right? The one that is leading the pack, so to speak, is the hypothalamus, all right? Now, the hypothalamus does a couple of things. So there's various things that stimulate your hypothalamus, from neural stimulation to hormones circulating in the blood. A number of things can stimulate the hypothalamus. Upon stimulation, the hypothalamus can do two things. Number one, part of the hypothalamus will and that's all of this is hypothalamus cells, note that these are neurons, which are part of the hypothalamus. They start up here, but they end here in this area of the posterior pituitary. So when these hypothalamic cells are stimulated, they will initiate action potentials. They'll get down to the bottom here, and then we'll do a release of two hormones, oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone, or ADH. All right. We talked about the role of oxytocin a moment ago. ADH, we'll worry about that when we get to the kidney. All right. So the posterior pituitary does not, I repeat, does not synthesize hormones itself. It serves as simply a depot. The hormones are stimulated by, are created, are synthesized by these hypothalamic cells. But those hypothalamic cells are terminating here in the posterior pituitary. So oxytocin and ADH are released from the posterior pituitary, but they're not synthesized by the cells in the posterior pituitary. They are synthesized by the hypothalamus. Now, the second thing that happens, hypothalamus now will also release its own hormones, different hormones, and they will target the anterior pituitary here, right? So basically, when they go to this part, this pituitary here, they will stimulate the cells within the anterior pituitary to make their own hormones, right? So the hormones that are released from the hypothalamus and they drive via this vascular shunt over here to the anterior pituitary. What are they? They are thyroid stimulating hormone, follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, adrenal corticotrophic hormone, growth hormone, and prolactin. TSH, FSH, LH, ACTH, GH, and PRL. All right. So these are the products that are produced and synthesized and released from the anterior pituitary. The hypothalamus controls this. So one of the hormones, for instance, one of the hormones that are released from the hypothalamus that will result in the release of these hormones. It's simple. Well, it's actually really hard. TSH releasing hormone, FSH releasing hormone, LH releasing hormone, etc. So those are the hormones that are released here. They control the synthesis of new hormones here. And these are those hormones here. We'll talk about what they do later. All right. So within the brain, we have the hypothalamus and the pituitary. The hypothalamus controls the pituitary. In the posterior pituitary, it serves as simply a depot. It does not synthesize hormones itself. The anterior pituitary, on the other hand, does, under control of hormones that are released from the hypothalamus. Right? We'll go into more depth as we move along. Okay. Again, so another thing the hypothalamus does, since it's part of the nervous system, it is also not only producing these hormones that are locally delivered from the hypothalamus and go to the anterior pituitary, and we'll talk about how that works in a moment, but they also are hardwired to outside of the central nervous system, right? So let's talk about the pituitary. I introduced that concept last Thursday. It's this pyramid-shaped organ that sits above each of your kidneys. It has an outer medulla and an inner cortex. An inner medulla and an outer cortex. So here's the medulla, and this outer portion is the cortex. Now, the hypothalamus controls that organ, but it controls it differently, depending on whether we're going to the medulla or the cortex. In terms of the medulla, there is a direct neural wiring connection circuit between the hypothalamus and the adrenal medulla. So when the hypothalamus is stimulated, there will be nerve impulses that will eventually get to the medulla, and it will release your catecholamines, epinephrine, norepinephrine, your sympathetic nervous system neurotransmitters, and they will stimulate your sympathetic nervous system, increase heart rate, increase cardiac contractions, etc., right? That's your fight or flight syndrome we talked about earlier. Right? That's your adrenal medulla. So there's a hardwired hookup, if you will, connection between the hypothalamus and the medulla. In the case of the cortex, what happens is this. It's a little bit more complex. It's not neural connections. It's complete. So the hypothalamus releases ACTH releasing hormone. That goes to the anterior pituitary. It releases ACTH. ACTH travels via the blood to the adrenal cortex, and the adrenal cortex then will release cortisol, right? As well as mineralocorticoids. So glucocorticoids are cortisol or corticosterone. In humans, it's cortisol. In rodents, it's corticosterone, all right? And these will have impact. So if we're talking, generally speaking, when we think of stress responses, short-term stresses, for instance, like we've talked about fight or flight syndrome, that needs a quick response. That means neural hookup. So that means catecholamines. Right? If we're going to have a long-term response to stress over weeks, days, months, we're not caring. Speed is not important. It's longevity of response. And this is under the control of a different set of hormones, primarily the glucocorticoids and to a lesser extent, the mineralocorticoids. And those are driven by the hormones that are released from the cortex. All right. So, and these two slides, I've shown you how actual brain neural tissue is part of the endocrine system. I've showed you how the hypothalamus controls the pituitary. And in this example, I've showed you how that we can have neural stimulation outside of the brain. That means, so we start at the hypothalamus and we end in the adrenal medulla, and then we can have these systems of a hormone inducing the releasing of hormone A, inducing the release of hormone B controlling the release of hormone C. Right? So we can have neural control direct, and we can have hormone control that is inducing the release of these various hormones. Right? And this also implies this additional cross-reactivity between the two systems of communication. And the final one we've already talked about, I won't spend a lot of time, is the synapse. Remember, you only have electrical conductivity within a neuron. In order for neuron to talk to neuron, we have to convert an electrical signal to a chemical signal. So in the synapse, we have the presynaptic membrane. We have, again, your quiz, all right? Question 1, all right? So we have a graded potential. It fires, it creates we have these channels on the postsynaptic membrane of this receiving cell. There is a change in sodium transport. We get the initiation of a graded potential. It then is enough to reach threshold. At the axon hillock, it will fire a set of action potentials. Action potentials get to the end of the axon, and at that, the terminal bud, we no longer have these, voltage-gated channels for sodium. We have voltage-gated channels for calcium. They open, calcium flows in. We have exocytosis, release of neurotransmitter, a chemical, also a hormone. It diffuses across the synaptic cleft where it binds to receptors on the postsynaptic membrane. And as long as those are occupied, they're open, sodium flows in, and we generate a graded potential on the downstream cell. So that's synaptic signaling. Also, your clue to what the solution is for question 1, all right, from last week's quiz. Okay, now, let me reemphasize that a hormone can only direct a variable in one direction. So in other words, I'm going to give you this example for maintaining blood glucose homeostasis, right? I think I've already introduced this, but you eat Krispy Kreme donuts, you get a spike in your blood glucose, that's your variable. This has to be read by your pancreas. Now you're going to initiate the release of a hormone, insulin. Insulin will go to receptors in tissues, skeletal muscle and fat, where it will induce the uptake of this glucose. The removal of glucose from the circulation into these cells results in a reduction in the concentration of glucose. This is read again by the pancreas, and there's negative feedback so that we don't continue to drop the glucose levels. All right? The role of insulin is one thing. It is to, in this context, it is to reduce glucose levels. All right? So, after you've eaten this dozen or so Krispy Kreme donuts, you feel guilty, as well you should, and you swear off food for the next 3 days. You make it about 3 hours, because what's going to happen is there's this huge peak of glucose because of the processed sugars that you consume. We will ignore the oil. We will ignore the flour and all the other stuff. All right? So we'll just focus on the sugar. Your sugar levels are going up rapidly, then they are going down, but the cells continue to, you're using glucose all the time for energy. So if you are not taking it in, that means it's got to come from someplace in order to maintain those levels, right? So eventually what's going to happen is your blood glucose, because you're not eating anything, your glucose level is dropping down. You don't want to add any more insulin, because that's just going to make it go down faster. You want to make it go up. So you cannot use insulin. What you use is a different hormone called glucagon. It also happens to be produced and controlled within the same pancreas, but its job is that when the level drops down below the preset value, you don't want insulin, you want glucagon. Glucagon is released. Glucagon goes to the liver. You ate all of those Krispy Kreme donuts, your sugar level was so high, you exceeded the capacity of your fat and muscle cells to take it all up. All of that extra glucose, all that extra sugar was stored in your liver as glycogen. Okay, think of it, I'm depositing in my checking account or savings account. Now, the role and what glucagon is, that's the withdrawal from those stored samples that converted back to glucose. My blood glucose level goes up, and I now get in there. And then, of course, with negative feedback, I don't overshoot. So, for a variable controlled by a hormone is needed to change it in each direction. No hormone can change it in both directions. It doesn't make sense. Think about your HVAC system. You have two effectors. You got a furnace and you got an air conditioned system. So if you only have an air conditioned system, what happens when you get cold weather? All it can do is make it colder. So that's not going to change anything. So, and the same vice versa when you're talking in the summer and you have your heating unit. So you have to have both effectors, one to take it in one direction and one the other. So it's the same thing here. All right. So this is just a different way of looking at it. Okay, I used the seesaw technique of control system expression in the prior slide. Here's a different one. They're saying the same thing. I'm not going to spend any more time on it. And here's also an example when I talked about the parathyroid hormone controlling blood calcium. This is just another way of expressing it as well. Why am I showing you all these multiple strategies? Hoping that one of them will work for you. Everybody looks at these, and some of those are easier to understand than others, depending on who you are. So that's why I'm giving you a range of possibilities to consider. Now, let's do another one. Let's do growth hormone. As the name implies, growth hormone is responsible for controlling growth. All right. So I'm going to bring it into play because it's a little bit more complex. So we start at the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus releases growth hormone releasing hormone. That travels via the blood to the anterior pituitary, where we'll have the release of growth hormone. Now, growth hormone has two effects. Number one, it goes to the liver, where it will induce the secretion of a new hormone called insulin-like growth factor. All right. Or it can go to and it can also go to other tissues. And putting things in historical context. In 1972, it was thought that growth hormone did not have direct effects outside of the liver. Okay? Because it was thought that it went to the liver, induced IGFs, and IGFs had all the effects of growth hormone. So they said that, and the purpose of it, the reason they said this was that no one had identified growth hormone receptors in any tissues other than the liver at that time. So that's why they said that they thought it had to go through the liver to have its effect. But in the 80s, we discovered growth hormone receptors in all the tissues of the body, practically. So no longer, I mean, it is in the liver, but other tissues as well. Now, these IGFs are going to be responsible for controlling bone growth and muscle growth and so on, as well as they actually control protein synthesis and metabolism and all of that. There's negative feedback on everything. All right. Next is the anti-insulin actions of growth hormone. These are independent of the growth effects. So if growth hormone is elevated, it will induce the breakdown of fat to release via lipolysis to release fatty acids, which are going to produce energy sources. And it will also contribute to metabolism, increasing blood sugar and so on. All right. This has been used, when I was a graduate student many decades ago, I worked in this area. All right. So those of you who can consume dairy products, let's say buy milk. If you buy milk without a label, it will just say milk. Chances are in this country, the cows were treated with growth hormone to promote their milk production. Now, if you get it organically, it will specifically say BST, which means growth hormone, bovine growth hormone, free. That means it wasn't treated. They weren't treated. All right. But most of the milk or dairy products you consume in this country, the herd was injected with growth hormone to increase their productivity of milk. It enhances milk production by 20%, which is extremely significant. That's the make or break for a dairy farmer. All right. Now, so if you get, how does growth hormone have its effect? You inject them, it mobilizes fats, it mobilizes carbohydrates, and all of that goes into milk production. That's how you get the increase in milk production. All right. I will say, because I dealt with this as a graduate student, there was a lot of pushback in the late 80s, early 90s. The pushback was, well, at the beginning, the DNA sequence of bovine growth hormone had not been derived yet. So the recombinant growth hormone that was used to deliver these cows was human-based. The first pushback came from people that said we're cannibals because we are delivering a human-based protein. It gets in the milk. We consume the milk, so we're consuming human products, so therefore we are cannibals. Yes. Number one, the growth hormone did not make it to the milk, so, I mean, aside from however you feel on that, milk doesn't get it. There was also concerns aside from the cannibalistic part, that there was the increase of growth hormone and IGF-1s in milk. Kids ate it and they grew too much. No, it's not in milk. It doesn't get in milk. So it is under those effects. Now, that's why it is all over that's why it's used today, because there are no downsides. Now, well, there are downsides. The downsides had nothing to do with the milk product. The downsides are if you're going to mobilize fats and carbohydrates, you need to feed that cow more in order to allow for that increase in productivity. If you don't, you're going to have problems with reproduction and so forth. But there is no impact on you, the consumer. All right? Now, so I'm just showing this as an example because it starts to get more complex. All right. If we continue that, in human context, growth hormone has been proposed in the early 90s as a pathway to the fountain of youth. So as you get older, your growth hormone and your IGF levels go down. So the argument is let's bring those back up to what they are young, and you will enhance the activity of an old person. And the clinical trials have never shown that to be significant. Where things have gotten problematic is that if you use either growth hormone or IGF-1 for sports enhancement, this has been used and it continues to be used today. So there was there are a number of some baseball players, some ex-Pirate players, that one of the reasons they won their awards it was because they were taking growth hormone and IGF-1. So there was also some problems with, for instance, wrestlers and so forth, high school kids getting access to these materials. And the problem, what I want to emphasize is don't. I don't care about it being illegal. Don't. Because you're likely to screw a whole bunch of stuff up, especially if you are a teenager. So this is a very simplistic set showing you all the stuff. So you have your hypothalamus controlling your anti-pituitary, that's controlling your IGF-1 in bones, and we're just looking at bone growth and all these feedbacks. So if you start delivering exogenous growth hormone or IGF-1, you're screwing all this stuff up. All right. And it really isn't. Now, I also, in the 90s, I used to do a lot of consulting work for one of the companies in Australia that sold one of the clinical grade IGF-1s. And they were concerned because, I remember, this is before Amazon. So you could get these drugs off the internet. All right. The problem was there's no regulation of the internet at that point in time. There's no FDA that's international. So you don't know what you're getting. So what we did was we bought off the internet 10 different versions of IGF-1. And the company wanted us to just simply, number one, they don't want their name, it's not that their product was being used, but they're still worried about the name of IGF-1. So they asked, of those 10 versions, was there actually IGF-1 in them? Out of those 10 that were sold as IGF-1, 8 of those did not have any measurable IGF-1. The other 2 had a little bit, but nothing near what they stated they had. So basically, the people were buying stuff, they were consuming it with the intent of providing themselves with IGF-1, but they weren't getting anything. That's the good aspect of it. What the bad aspect of it is, what were they getting? And could that have some deleterious effects? All right. So the promise, don't buy shit off. Even today, don't just buy stuff off the internet. All right. Especially something like that. But now we have, there is enough of this stuff clinically going around but not for this application, that there's a large black market. So there are a lot of IGF-1 clinical grade materials which are being diverted through the black market for these applications. Yes, you can get it. Don't use it. Okay. Now, I've kind of alluded to this, but what controls the release of a hormone from its source cells? 3 things. It can be under humoral control. That means there's something in the blood that's measured. For instance, I talked about calcium. Calcium is a humoral regulator of PTH release. It can be neural. Remember, hypothalamus is firing a nervous signal that goes to the medulla, and now we have catecholamines released in response. Or it can be hormonal or endocrine, in that one hormone induces a release of another hormone. I've given you examples of all 3 of those prior today. Please remember what each of those are. and how they can work. Now, so far we've talked about everything's working. Everything's working. We have homeostasis. What happens when we don't? We call that an endocrine pathology, and that can be the result of a number of things. Number one, it can be a result of subnormal hormone productions. That means there's not enough hormone. The concentration is not high enough. Number two, you can have too much of a hormone. Number three, you can have the production of hormones, but they are not normal structurally. You can have a resistance to hormone action, and you can have some disruption of transport, or you can have two or more of the above. Okay, all of these can result in pathology. So I'll spend the bulk of the rest of this time I have with you and talk about the pathologies, because that's the fun part of endocrinology. How many of you taken psych? Anybody taking psychology? By the time you got out of the class, you figured you had 5 or 6 different diseases, right? Because they go through and it's like, oh, that's me. All right. So this is the same thing. In endocrinology, it gets really in because it's all the focus about the pathologies. Okay. If you ever look at an endocrine textbook, all you're seeing is pathologies. All right. So let's talk about some of those pathologies in respect to either too much or too little, and so forth. So let's start with acromegaly. Acromegaly is based on too much, an excess of growth hormone. Now, what's also important, which I haven't talked about until right this moment, is are you a child, are you growing child, or are you an adult? Post-growth, during growth, post-growth, child, adult, all right? The responses are going to be different. The pathologies will express differently. So this is acromegaly, right? Now, this young woman is 16 years old. She is an adult, at least in terms of skeletal maturity, because she stopped growing at puberty, and that was around 13, all right? So she is not growing anymore, right? Looks normal. We go to 35 years, same person, but notice that there are some physical changes. In this case, her face, her nose is getting a bit larger, her jaw is extending, she's starting to get something called beetle brow. We go to her early 50s and things are further accentuated. And we even see that her hands are getting involved. They're not any longer, they're just wider. Okay? So this acromegaly is too much growth hormone after growth stops. Okay? So growth hormone isn't just involved in growth. All right? Now, this is, how does this happen? Typically, it's usually, not all the ways, but usually there is a benign tumor either in the pituitary or the hypothalamus, which is stimulating an overproduction of growth hormone. All right. Now, well, what about childhood? What happens if we have changes in growth hormone during childhood when we're growing? All right. So this is after growth stops, but we had these pathologies during growth. Normal for comparison purposes. Giganticism means too much growth hormone, so you're growing further than you normally would. And we have a dwarfism, which is not enough growth hormone, right? So can be all three of those, two of those. Anyway, so it all depends. The pathology depends. Are you a growing child or are you an adult? Okay. However, it all depends on when did we have the increase in growth hormone. So an individual can be either an individual that is usually acromegalic was initially suffered from giganticism because normally the disruption pathology occurred during childhood when they were growing. So a perfect example I use is Andre the Giant. How many people have seen Princess Bride, the movie? One of my favorite, it's a good book too. But anyway, so Andre the Giant, he started his career as a wrestler. And basically, you can start to see, this is it. He was in his early 20s here. He's much bigger. He's 7'4". But as he's getting older, you can see the acromegaly starting to show up. So generally speaking, if you are giganticism and if you live long enough, you will start to express acromegaly because the pathology doesn't go away when you transition from childhood to adulthood, right? So I always like to bring in Robert Wadlow. He's 19. He was 8'10". This is him with his family, normal mom and dad, siblings, and all that. He died at 22. Okay. So the point is, you're going to say, well, wait a minute, what's the downside of having giganticism? The downside is not all the tissues grow at the same rate. So what happens are the bones and the cartilage, the bones tend to grow faster. That stretches the muscles. But one of the things that doesn't grow as well or as fast is the heart. And typically speaking, what a lot of, especially those that have really enhanced conduction, of which this one does, he actually could, he could never play basketball because he's got to walk around with a crutch because all of his tissues aren't growing, they're not developing at the same rate, so he is very unstable. Ultimately, he died of a heart attack because his heart didn't grow at the same rate. And I'll throw this one in. I figured, well, I showed you a bunch of crap that was decades old, and I'll show you some ongoing. These are both examples. For instance, one example, giganticism, and over here we have dwarfism. And so this is the range of that we can see, and all of this has to do with not enough or too much growth hormone. And it also depends. Remember, your pathology is childhood or adult, too much or too little. And so let's change hormones. Let's go to thyroid hormone. So thyroid hormone is produced by the thyroid gland right here. It influences metabolism rates, right? Males, humans tend to have a higher metabolic activity than females. That's one of the reasons why females live longer. Generally speaking, males burn out faster. All right. Now, T3, thyroid hormone, we can talk about first off, not enough. So we have, that's called myxedema. So myxedema is specific for adults. Now, this was actually fairly common depending on where you're in the United States. If you're in the Great Lakes regions at the turn of the last century, just before somewhere in the late 1800s, and you're so far away from the salt water, because salt water, whether you're having seafood or seaweed, etc., there's lots of iodine, and iodine is critical for making thyroid hormone. If you live in the central part of the United States, so like say in the late 1800s, you didn't have a source of iodine. That means the body could not make thyroid hormone, and in response, your thyroid gland would enlarge here, and you could see this here. And you get puffiness, you slow down because you're not producing that hormone, your metabolic activity drops, okay? Now, in this case, it's easily addressable. You just take dietary sources of iodine and it's reversed, and you come back to normal. This is pre-treatment, post-treatment, okay? Now, all of you have seen Morton salt, right? Salt, you see salt, everyone uses table salt. If you look at the table salt, look at it, and it'll say iodine fortified, supplemented. The reason I bring in Morton salt, because that was the original one. So at the turn of the last century, they said, there's this problem. How do it's solvable by these microscopic amounts of iodine. How am I going to get it to people? Everybody has salt. So they put it in salt. And you just have a little bit, and that's all it takes. So if you look at your salt, most of it will say iodinized salt. You can get like sea salt, it's naturally iodinized, but then you can have other forms of salt which isn't. But if you see the salt and the container says iodinized salt, that's the reason why they add it. Okay. Now, what about childhood? That's a different effect because thyroid hormone is also critical for normal development, especially the brain. Now, if the children are exposed to not enough iodine, so therefore they are having not enough thyroid hormone, that results in permanent suppression of growth and development. And that is not recoverable. It is not recoverable. So the adults are fine, children lost, right? Now, let's go the other way, too much. So let's go to Graves' disease. That's too much thyroid. That means we're overproducing that. That speeds things up. That also results in these bulging eyes. You've probably seen the commercials on TV as well. I like to use Marty Feldman. This is from Young Frankenstein. If you haven't seen it, see it. It's the only Frankenstein movie worth watching. And I've watched them all over the decades. But anyway, he suffered from Graves' disease. All right. Next, glucocorticoids. Cortisol in humans, you can have not enough. That's Cushing's disease. And what happens here, you basically get what's called a moon face. You get the face just increases with deposition. You get something called a buffalo hump between your shoulder blades. Then, of course, if you have that's too much, it's Cushing. Not enough, it's Addison's disease. John F. Kennedy, president from the early 60s, he suffered from that. This is easy to address here. You just give cortisol, and it's reversible. In the case of Cushing's disease, you're producing too much. It all depends. So this is cortisol. So think about your pathways to get to cortisol. You start with ACTH, releasing hormone from the hypothalamus, ACTH from the anterior pituitary, then cortisol from the adrenal cortex. Okay, I can have it disrupted any one of those three places. Okay. All right, now let's get to the big one, diabetes. Right, there are two forms of diabetes, type 1 and type 2. Right? So basically, type 1 is insulin dependent diabetes. This is the one that is generally associated with children. All right. You are not born with type 1 diabetes. It is a result of the body's immune system attacking itself. Basically, what happens is sometime during childhood, there is an initiating inflammatory event, and the immune system starts to attack the pancreas and attacking and destroying the cells that are responsible for secreting insulin. This takes years to happen. Once you have enough of these beta islet cells in the pancreas destroyed, you cannot maintain insulin and you will ultimately die unless you receive exogenous insulin. Prior to 1925, diabetes type 1 was a death sentence. No one survived once you got it in advance. With the application of insulin in the mid-20s up and today, they can live essentially normal lives. You just apply exogenous insulin. All right. Now, there is a genetic component to this. It tends to have a genetic component, but it also, you're not born with it, but there has to be a triggering event to induce it. All right. Now, this means you don't have enough insulin. The second one is type 2. You have too much. It's the opposite effect. So that is typically, historically associated with getting old, but you're not giving up the food. So you're eating it too much. So what you're doing is you're maintaining artificially high glucose levels. That means that your body is producing more insulin to accommodate that. And your insulin levels stay too high. So the body is attempting to protect itself, so it becomes less sensitive to the glucose so that it isn't producing, so it doesn't change insulin levels because that isn't changeable, but it can be less responsive. So in other words, it takes more insulin to get the same effect. All right. Now, type 2 diabetes, if it's caught early enough, it can just simply be controlled by diet and social change. Don't eat as much. Watch what you eat. Okay. Then, of course, your blood glucose levels go down, your insulin levels go down, and everything's okay. If, on the other hand, you choose not to do that, eventually what's going to happen, in order to maintain enough insulin, they will start giving you exogenous insulin. And that just speeds the whole process to failure up because eventually they can't give you enough insulin and you will die. All right. That's type 2 diabetes. Now, in the last 30 years, especially the last 20 years, there has been a huge uptake in type 2 diabetes. It is no longer associated exclusively with old folks like me. It's now associated with young children. because they're switching to Western diets, and the obesity is going up. And what goes along with obesity is type 2 diabetes. Now, so we started to observe type 2 diabetes in children in the 90s, and it's really going up, especially not only in the United States, but in China, India, etc. And the problem is we have we don't know what it's going to mean for these kids when they're adults. I mean, some of them are adults now, but I mean, we just don't have any historical concept of it. So we'll see, right? Now, so type 1, type 2 diabetes, I've kind of gone through that. So we'll go on down. So it's an easy thing to solve, right? You got type 1 diabetes, you just give exogenous insulin, everything's hunky-dory. Nope. Okay? Because it's a very complex hemopoietic, it's a extremely complex control system. All right? So your body gives you insulin when you need insulin. Initially, what people would do is be injecting themselves, and that you would inject yourself several times a day. All right? And that just gives sporadic increases and so forth. So, you'd try to gauge that with food intake and so on. And if you're a child and you don't like needles, or an adult and don't like needles, it's kind of hard to deliver it. All right. So, one of the things that was starting to be developed in the mid 70s was pumps, insulin pumps, which sought to overcome that and give you more continuous stimulation. All right. And basically, what we came to is that was still the same problem. Whether you're injecting it or pumping it is not properly corresponding to the circulating levels of glucose. So artificial pancreases are in the process of being developed. Here is one that dates back to 2016, and it is measuring blood glucose and then will release insulin based on the levels of glucose measured. So technically an artificial pancreas, right? And this is version 2016. There are some more ones that are coming on further out. This is a more updated volume from 2022. So basically it seems to show that it's not there, but it's getting closer, okay? Now, well, let's skip all of that. Let's just use transplantation. Beta islet transplantation is a clinical reality. All right. Most of this work is based on from the University of Alberta, and that is a transplant. Okay, so you take beta islet cells from a donor, you put them in a recipient. It works, but in order for transplant to work, you need to use immunosuppressants, and so that's an issue. All right. So this is a clinical reality, but we need to get beyond this. All right. And there's all kinds of stuff. This is a major aspect within regenerative medicine, tissue engineering. How can we replace the pancreas, whether artificially or an engineered system? All right. This is some work that my lab has done, because this is addressing how can we control the immunoregulation? Can we do one-time immunoregulation without continuous immunosuppression? And this pretty much suggests that you can. And I'm just going to move on because I'm out of time. All right. And that gets us the GLPs. Everybody's heard of GLPs, Ozempic, etc. All right. Billions upon billions of dollars are spent on them. And they are having a lot of success. They're reducing, in obese people are losing 16-20% of their weight mass, and certain of them can maintain that. We're getting cardiovascular improvements, etc. Okay, it's not a panacea, but it is showing a lot of success. All right, and initially these drugs were approved for type 2 diabetes, to help you control your intake, because if you control intake, you can control type 2 diabetes. But it was found that they were losing significant weight. That then led to the first approval of this drug as a weight control drug. And that's where we get the Ozempic and the Wegovy, which you can see all their commercials on TV or streaming or whatever. All right. So This is today and for the ongoing future, right? But this is not an insulin repair. This is control. This is only now. Obesity not only leads to type 2 diabetes, there's cardiovascular problems, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of things, especially for chronic disease, that are addressed by that. All right. Now, so this has the potential for being completely disruptive technology. Okay, so all kinds of things, because this is going to affect healthcare, clothing, transportation. You don't think about transportation, but when you get on an airplane, they can't weigh you because that is, I don't understand, but you can't weigh you. They have to make certain assumptions that everybody weighs this weight. And so they multiply that times the number of patients, and that's the weight of the plane added to the plane. That's bullshit, but that's what they have to do. Because those numbers are based on like 60 years ago, and we're a lot fatter than we were 60 years ago. For those numbers are wrong, all right? But anyway, that can change. Diet industry really got hit big. I mean, all the major players, they're out of business now because this overseeded them, okay? Not to mention food and beverage industry, because you're not eating as much of these foods. So that's a big impact. All right, we want to finish. I still have a few minutes. I want to finish with endocrine disruptors. I alluded to this when I began my discussion. And I talked about chemical agents that are a part of manufacturing that are called also forever chemicals. So they persist not for years, not for decades, but for thousands of years, hundreds to thousands of years, depending on the molecule. And they are everything BPA. Those of you who have water bottles and plastic, they'll say BPA free. That's because BPA, which is a plasticizer, causes a number of endocrine disruptors, and especially it was first removed from baby bottles because there were issues that were observed with developing babies who were consuming their milk formula through those. All right. DDT, that is a poison that had the ability to be the safest pesticide that man had ever developed. Okay. And it was used quite extensively during World War II, post-World War II. It was so safe that people just didn't worry about trying to control how much they used. So they just put a little bit's good, well, let's add more. So the environment got so saturated with it, so it started to disrupt raptor eggs. Those are eagles and hawks and so forth, because it would get into the health food chain and it disrupted things. When I was a kid in Florida, we had issues with mosquitoes. So every week the mosquito truck would come by, and what they were using in the 60s was DDT. So they would just spray this DDT, and as kids used to follow the spew, follow behind it. And so, yeah, I breathed my share of that crap in. But, and minor issues, but nothing we're talking about. But anyway, so it was used a lot. All right, it's not used now. PCBs and so on. PCBs, if the mud over here in the Mon River is got enough PCB, if you grab some of it up, there's got enough PCBs that it's going to be there for thousands of years. Okay, even though they haven't used PCBs for 50 years, but this stuff was laid down, it's there. All right. Here's what you want. You want to go to the Pennsylvania Fish and Wildlife, and you want to look at the waterways where they tell you how much fish you can have from whatever lake or river in the state. It will tell you, for instance, Lake Erie used to be dead in the 60s. It was a dead lake, and then it's come back. But mercury, PCBs, those get into the fish, and you can look it up. And for instance, they'll say, don't eat anything out of the Mon, especially around the city. Don't eat anything out of the Allegheny out here either. But then some of the places you can get away, depending on the fish, you may not eat anything, like it's a catfish or carp or ground, something that eats in the bottom feeder, don't eat any of it. And if it's something else like a salmon or a trout or something, you can eat maybe once a month or something. But if you look there, it'll say what the contaminant is. It's usually going to be PCBs or mercury. All right. And all of these things act as the reason we call them endocrine disruptors is because even though they were never produced in the body, they can bind to receptors and disrupt normal endocrine communication. Right? And the primary issues, what we're concerned about, is these disruptions can result in obesity complications, which can also be dependent or independent of diabetes type 2, as well as cardiovascular disruption. So these are the three primary physiological disruptions, and there's a lot of, and if you note, there's a lot of crossover between, say, BPAs involved in all three, right? And then there's cross reactivity between those. So these endocrine disruptors aren't going away. What's the sad part is we don't know. There are many endocrine disruptors we don't even know yet because there's no focus. There was supposed to be an FDA movement back about 5 years ago to look for them so that we could look for them now rather than wait 40 years, and they've had a big societal impact. But they haven't done anything since they created that study section. So anyway, it's a problem. And so I'm out of time. I'm going to leave that with you. So this now concludes the endocrine system. We're done with that. Thursday, come prepared for exam 1. All right. So I'll see everybody Thursday. Yes.